She was 21 years old, and in the precise, unhurried way that bureaucratic kindness so often works, she had just been made nobody's problem. That's how we'd describe it if you pressed us. Not a tragedy, not a drama, just a quiet rearrangement of accounts. Della Rusk had grown up knowing the smell of paper, not the fresh, sharp smell of a new book, but the older, more honest smell of paper that had been worked, sized, folded, pressed under weights until the grain ran true. Her mother, Philippa Rusk, had been a bookbinder in the small Ontario town of Larder Creek, and Della's earliest years had been lived between the slant of a cutting board and the soft exhaust of a bone folder being drawn across a folded signature. Philippa had taught her daughter everything she knew. How to pare leather to a translucent thinness without tearing it. How to feel when a spine was square by the weight of it in your hands. How to press a book so it dried with no memory of having ever been opened to the world before. When Della was 8, a fever came through Larder Creek and took Philippa in the space of 10 days. What Della was left with was a small canvas roll of her mother's tools and a bone folder, a single piece of polished ox bone, warm yellow and worn smooth from years of use, that Philippa had been saving to give her daughter when she was old enough for proper work. The folder was cool and dense in Della's palm, and she held it for a long time after the fever had gone and the house had gone quiet in that particular way. That means a house will never be loud again. She was sent to live with her uncle, Morris Dale, her mother's older brother, who ran a dry goods supply operation out of the southern edge of town and measured everything in terms of profit and carrying cost. His wife, Irene Dale, was a woman of strict economies who kept the house in a permanent state of brisk efficiency and saw her new ward as one more inefficiency that would need to be managed. They gave Della a room in the back of the house, above the storeroom, and within a week she had been given her duties: the laundry, the kitchen garden, the mending, the heavy cleaning that Irene considered beneath the other staff. She was 8 years old. She did not complain. For the next 13 years, Della lived in a particular state that's hard to name. Not quite invisible, not quite present. She ate at the family table, but rarely spoke at it. She slept in the back room but had no lock on the door. She worked steadily, and without complaint, and Morris would sometimes note, in the way he noted the reliability of a good hand scale, that she was useful. That was the whole of his regard for her. The one person who ever saw her as more than her function was an old man named Cecil Munro, who kept a bookseller's shop 2 doors down from the Dale's supply warehouse. Cecil had run his shop for 40 years and was a passable bookbinder himself. He'd learned it from a man who'd learned it in Edinburgh. And he recognized immediately, the first time he saw the child walking past with her canvas roll tucked under one arm, what she was carrying and why. He began inviting her in after school, when Irene's list of chores allowed it. He taught her what her mother hadn't yet gotten to: how to set a proper kettle stitch, how to back a spine with a hammer without cracking the signatures, how to match cloth grain to board grain so a cover would lie flat for 100 years. He never made a fuss of it. He simply showed her, and she learned, and they worked in comfortable quiet, while the light changed outside the shop window. Cecil Munro died when Della was 18. He left his shop to a nephew in Kingston, who sold it within the month. He left Della nothing official. There was nothing to leave, but she carried everything he had shown her, in her hands, and in the careful patience with which she approached every piece of work. We'll pause here for just a moment, because we want you to understand something before we go further. Della Rusk was not yet broken. 13 years of being treated as a useful inconvenience had not taken that from her. It had, in a way, only made her quieter, more careful about where she placed her trust, more deliberate about what she noticed, and she noticed a great deal. The end of her time at the Dales' house came on a Wednesday morning in early May, in the same businesslike manner that everything involving Morris Dale came about. He called her from the storeroom to his office, a room she rarely entered because it smelled of old invoices and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything important. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his desk and informed her, in the same tone he used to discuss shipping delays, that his eldest son Clifford was to be married in July. His new wife would be taking over the running of the household. The arrangement of the back room, he explained, was no longer workable from a space use perspective, and since Irene had recently hired a girl from down the road to help with the heavier work, Della's position had, he was afraid, become redundant. He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside, he said, she would find $94. $60 of it was what her mother had left in trust, a small insurance policy Philippa had paid into, which Morris had been holding until Della came of age. The remaining 34 was what he considered a fair final reckoning for her years of work, calculated against room and board. She could take it or she could contest it, but he thought she would find, if she tried to contest it, that the room and board had been quite generous. Della stood still. She looked at the envelope. She felt something settle in her chest. Not grief exactly, more like the cool, clarifying feeling of finally understanding something she had suspected for a long time. She picked up the envelope. She said, "Thank you, Uncle Morris," and she walked out. "We want you to notice that." She thanked him. Not out of weakness, and not because she felt gratitude. She thanked him because she had watched Morris Dale for 13 years, and she understood, as clearly as she understood the grain of a piece of paper, that he was not a man who responded to anger or to tears. He responded to transactions. She had completed hers. There was nothing left to say. She went back to the storeroom and packed what was hers. 2 dresses, a wool shawl, her mother's canvas tool roll, and the bone folder, which she wrapped separately in a piece of cloth and tucked into the breast pocket of her coat, where she could feel it against her ribs when she breathed. She walked out of the Dales' house at first light the next morning and did not look back. The land registry office in Larder Creek was a low, dim building that smelled of damp ledger and wood rot. The clerk behind the counter was a man named Aloysius Gerke, a name that seemed too large for him, who wore a vest that had seen better decades and looked up at Della with the mild incuriosity of a man who had been mildly incurious about everything for 40 years. She had thought carefully on the walkover. She had $94. She had nowhere to sleep after tonight. She had skills that, in a town like Larder Creek, might eventually earn her a living. But only if she had a place to work from. She needed something with 4 walls and a roof. She also needed to eat while she figured the rest out. She did not put her money on the counter. She asked, instead, to see the register of available properties and their listed prices. Aloysius Gerke blinked at her, as though this were a novel request, which it apparently was, and then pulled a large, dog-eared ledger from beneath the counter and turned it to face her. She read it slowly. Most of what was available was beyond her reach. Land with water access, land near the mill road, land with standing timber. All of it ran to several $100s. At the very bottom of the ledger, entered in handwriting lighter than the rest, as though whoever had written it had not expected it to matter. Lot 12, Kettlebrook Mill Road. Derelict building, stone foundation, 5 acres approx. Price Inkle filing, $89. She pointed to it. This one. What's the condition of the structure? Aloysius Gerke looked at it and shrugged with the specific indifference of a man who had never personally cared about anything described in his ledger. Stone foundation, he said. The rest he didn't know. Nobody had been out there in years. The Kettlebrook Mill Road had been a logging spur for a company that folded in the late 70s, and the road had been going back to bush ever since. People say it leads to nothing, he offered, helpfully. Della thought of something Cecil Munro had told her once, when she'd asked why he kept a shelf of water-damaged books that no one ever bought. He'd said, "Damage doesn't mean finished. You don't know what a thing is worth until you look at it properly." "I'll take it," she said. "What are the filing fees included at that price?" He confirmed the amount. It came to exactly $89 flat. She counted out the bills with care, keeping $5 for food and supplies, and laid the exact amount on the counter. He stamped the deed, filed it, and handed her a copy in a brown paper sleeve. She walked out of the registry office as the legal owner of Lot 12, Kettlebrook Mill Road. A property she had not yet seen, and that the entire town of Larder Creek considered worthless. She bought a bag of oats, a half-pound of dried salt pork, a box of matches, and a full canteen at the general store, and started walking. She found the building at the end of her second day, just as the light was going gold and low over the tree line. It had once been a print shop and bindery. She could tell by the shape of it, the particular width of the windows that would have let in maximum light for close work, the stone chimney at the back that would have vented a press's heat in winter without filling the room. Now it sagged. The roof had collapsed at the northeast corner, and birch saplings had come up through the gap. The floorboards near the entrance had rotted through, and she tested each step before committing to it. 2 of the 4 walls were still structurally sound. The third had bowed outward badly enough that it would need to come down and be rebuilt from the foundation. The 4th, the back wall, where the chimney stood, was solid stone, dark with old soot and absolutely immovable. She stood in what remained of the building for a long time, feeling the particular weight of a place that had once held purposeful work. The smell of old ink was still there, faint and damp, soaked into the stone over many years of use. It was broken. It was hers. No one could come to this door and tell her her position had become redundant. She made camp inside the most sheltered corner, ate a careful meal of oats cooked over the stone hearth, and slept. The next morning she began. Her first task was practical and unglamorous. She cleared the debris, 2 days of it, rotted wood, collapsed rafters, broken glass, years of leaf fall and animal nesting. She piled it outside and burned what would burn. She left the stone chimney and its surround untouched until she had cleared everything around it, because her mother had always said, "Start with the anchor. Find what is solid and build from there." On the third day, she turned her attention to the hearth. The firebox was choked with ash that had compacted over years into a gray solid mass. She worked at it methodically with a fire poker she'd found in the debris, breaking it apart and sweeping it into a bucket. The work was dirty and slow. When she finally reached the back of the firebox and began to clear the hearthstone, a flat piece of granite about 2 feet across, she noticed something. The stone did not sit in mortar. It sat in a thin bed of compacted sand, and when she pressed the heel of her hand against its near edge, it shifted slightly, with a faint gritty sound, like something that had been placed rather than set. She went very still. She worked the tip of a flat chisel into the gap and pressed. The stone tilted. She set the chisel aside and used both hands, her fingers finding the edge, and lifted. The stone was heavier than she expected. Her arms shook with it, but it came free, and she set it carefully aside against the hearth wall, and she looked down into the hollow space beneath. Inside was a wooden box, not tin but a proper carpenter's box with dovetail corners and a fitted lid, wrapped in oilskin and tied with tarred twine. The oilskin had done its job faithfully. When she cut the twine and unfolded it, the wood underneath was still dark and dry and solid. The lid lifted off with a soft, clean sound. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was inside. On top, a single piece of brass typesetting block, a handset letter in the old style, the character R in a clean serif face, worn at the edges from long use. It fit exactly in the center of her palm. Under it, a folded letter on heavy correspondence paper, tied with a narrow length of linen tape. And beneath that, a canvas pouch, closed with a drawstring, that clinked when she lifted it and was heavier than seemed reasonable for its size. She opened the pouch first. Inside were bills, folded neatly, and a layer of silver coins at the bottom. She counted the bills twice, then the coins. $382. She sat with her hands in her lap for a long time after she finished counting, looking at the money, which was more than she had ever seen gathered in one place in her life, and which represented, she understood with a slow, spreading clarity, the entire immediate future of everything. Then she picked up the letter. The handwriting was precise and economical. The hand of someone who had set type for a living and understood that every character occupied space and space was not to be wasted. She unfolded the paper and read, "To whoever finds this place, my name is Ruth Oban. I ran a print shop and bindery from this building for 22 years, from 1871 until 1893, when the Kettlebrook Mill Company folded and took everything with it they legally could, and some things they couldn't. I hid this money because I was afraid they would take that too. They didn't find it. I am going to my sister in Halifax. I am 63 years old, and I have lived alone in this valley long enough. I do not expect to return. This money is the savings of a working life spent in service to a community. I printed handbills, school primers, land notices, and personal correspondence for the families who lived in this valley. They paid me what they could. This is what I saved over the years, and I had meant to leave it to those families. But by the time I went, they had scattered or retreated, and there was no one left to receive it at an address I could name. So I leave it for you instead. I don't know who you are, but I know something about the kind of person who ends up at the end of a road everyone else has given up on. I know that kind of person fairly well. Use it to build something that will stand. The stone foundation here is good. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The back wall will hold anything you put against it. The creek that runs through the property a quarter-mile east does not dry up even in August. I kept that note in my surveying records, and I include it here for you. If you need more than money, if you need community, which is a different and more important thing, Follow the mill road east for another 4 miles past the split birch, with the lightning scar running down its south face. The road curves north and drops into a small valley. There is a settlement there called Kettlebrook. It is not on any township map. The people there asked to be left off it after the mill company used official records against them to try to claim their land. They are private people, but they are good people, and they knew me well for many years. Tell them Ruth Oban sent you, and they will understand. Build something real. The press is gone. I could not carry it, and I could not leave it where the company might find it. But the knowledge of printing does not leave with the machine. Knowledge stays where it has been learned. I hope you find your footing here. I hope this place becomes what it was always capable of being. Yours in good faith, Ruth Oban, September 1893. Della read the letter 3 times. The third time, she read it slowly enough to feel each sentence settle into her, the way a well-pressed page settles flat, with finality and with ease. A woman she had never met and would never meet had looked forward across an unknown number of years and left her not just money, but a map. Not just a map, but a way of thinking about what the place could become. Ruth Oban had stood in this same broken room and looked at what was solid and decided to trust it with something worth saving. She had written a letter to a stranger and believed, with the practical faith of a working printer, that the stranger would be capable of receiving it. Della sat by the empty hearth in the failing light of the afternoon and held the brass R in one hand and her mother's bone folder in the other. She let herself feel, for the first time in a very long time, something she hadn't quite known how to call by name. It felt like standing on firm ground. It felt like standing on ground that was only hers. She walked back to Larder Creek the next morning, with a list she had composed entirely in her head. She went to the hardware merchant first, and she was specific: 20 pounds of 10-penny nails, a crosscut saw, a proper claw hammer, a draw knife, a hand plane, and 6 lengths of good dimensional lumber for the roof and wall repair. She bought roofing felt and a box of galvanized tacks. She bought a small cast-iron cook stove, squat and dependable-looking. She bought a month's supply of oats, saltfish, dried beans, and a good quantity of tallow candles. At the general store, she bought a bottle of linseed oil and 2 good brushes. She kept careful track of every dollar. She paid for all of it in bills, kept the remainder close, and said nothing about where any of it had come from. The hardware merchant recommended a hauler named Douglas Pratt, an older man, thick-necked and unhurried, who ran freight to the outlying properties with a team of heavy horses and a flatbed wagon. She found him in the livery yard, mending a harness trace with the focused patience of someone who had mended the same trace many times and expected to mend it many times more. She told him what she needed and where. He looked at her worn dress and her straight back and the way she met his eyes without apology, and said, "Kettlebrook Road, nobody goes out there." "I do," she said. "I own the property on lot 12. He was quiet for a moment. "Then Stone Foundation Place, used to be a bindery." She nodded. "Roof's gone in at the corner," he said. "That's correct. I'm fixing it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he named her a price that was fair. Not generous, but fair, which she respected more than generosity from a stranger. She agreed to it, and he said to have her goods at the yard by 6 the following morning. He was as good as his word. The wagon pulled out at first light with everything piled neatly under a canvas tarp, and Douglas drove with the steady economy of a man who had made this kind of trip 1,000 times. They didn't talk much. At one point, when the road narrowed and he had to judge his clearance through a tight section of encroaching spruce, she anticipated his line and pointed without being asked. He glanced at her sideways. "You've got a surveyor's eye," he said. "My mother taught me to look at things properly," she said. When they arrived, he helped her unload without being asked, which surprised her. Before he left, he stood for a moment, considering the stone chimney and the quality of the foundation, and he said, in a quiet, appraising tone, "Whoever built this built it to last. Whoever let it go didn't deserve it." She thanked him. He touched the brim of his hat and turned the team back toward Larder Creek. She stood alone in the clearing with her lumber and her tools and her cook stove, and she began. The work took 3 weeks of total, focused effort. She pulled the rotted floorboards and replaced them, working outward from the solid corners. She repaired the 3 good walls and pulled down the bowed one, and rebuilt it from the foundation up with a combination of the original stone and new timber framing. The roof she rebuilt completely, laying new purlins across the repaired rafters and tacking down the roofing, felt with careful overlapping rows before the first rain came, which it did on the 12th day, and which did not come through. Her hands changed. The calluses from years of housework shifted, becoming harder at different angles. The saw callus on the right palm, the hammer callus at the base of the first two fingers. She learned, by trial and error, the difference between a nail going in true and a nail going in at an angle that would pull out in a year. She made mistakes and corrected them. She did not expect not to make mistakes. Her mother had told her once that a bookbinder who had never ruined a book hadn't bound enough of them yet. At the end of the third week, she stood inside the building in the early morning, and it was clean, and it was square, and the light came through the two repaired windows at exactly the angle she had intended. The cook stove drew well. The floor was level. The stone chimney at the back wall was exactly as solid as Ruth Oban's letter had promised it would be. She allowed herself one morning of simply sitting in it, drinking tea from her tin cup, listening to the creek running a quarter-mile to the east, feeling the particular silence of a place that has been remade from what it once was into something it was always capable of becoming. Then she packed her canteen and her knapsack and walked east along the mill road. We want to tell you about Kettlebrook because it deserves to be told carefully. The road east from the bindery was overgrown but still passable, the old corduroyed sections mostly intact beneath decades of leaf fall. After 4 miles, she found the split birch with the lightning scar running in a dark seam down its south face. The road curved north here, exactly as Ruth had written, and dropped off a gentle escarpment into a small valley she hadn't been able to see from higher ground. The valley was green in a way that made her stop walking. After 3 weeks of working in scrub and second growth, the bottom of this valley had old trees, maple and white birch, and a stand of white pine on the east slope that must have been 100 years old. And along the creek there were kitchen gardens and small orchards and half a dozen houses built of the same gray stone that ran through the valley's bedrock. Smoke moved from 2 chimneys. She could hear a hammer somewhere, a clean, steady sound. She walked down into the valley on a path that was clearly still used. And almost immediately a man appeared from behind a garden fence and stood watching her approach with the specific wariness of someone who has learned, through experience, to be careful about who comes down this particular path. "Road doesn't lead anywhere," he said. It was not a greeting. It was an established fact he was presenting for her consideration. "It led here," she said. He was quiet. "My name is Della Rusk," she said. "I've just repaired the building on lot 12, the old bindery, down the road. I found a box in the hearthstone and a letter inside it. The letter was signed by Ruth Oban. She told me to come and to tell you she'd sent me." The man looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recognition, the way you look at something you had given up expecting to see again. He said, "Wait here," and went inside. Within a few minutes, an older woman came out of the largest of the stone houses at the center of the settlement. She walked with a cane, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear and direct. She looked at Della the way a person looks at someone they are deciding whether to trust, which is a fair and reasonable thing to do when your community has spent 30 years making itself invisible for good reason. Her name was Flora Dench. She told Della this immediately, which Della later understood was itself a form of trust offered in return. Flora said she had known Ruth Oban for 15 years. She said Ruth had been the community's connection to the outside world. The one who printed their notices and their land documents and their school materials. The one who bought goods in Larder Creek and kept their existence quiet in the process. When the mill company had tried to claim the valley land using falsified survey coordinates, Ruth Oban, the printer, had printed the community's counter documents herself, at no charge. She had also printed 100 copies of a detailed account of the company's methods, and mailed them to newspapers in 3 provinces. The company had backed down. The people of Kettlebrook had, quietly and deliberately, arranged to be removed from the official township map as insurance against it ever happening again. They had not heard from Ruth in 3 years. They had assumed she was gone. Della sat with Flora Dench in her stone kitchen that afternoon and told her own story. Not the part about the money, not yet, but the part about the uncle and the registry office and the 3 weeks of work. Flora listened and then without interrupting. Around them, other members of the settlement filtered in and out in the way of small communities where news travels without needing to be announced. Flora said finally, "We don't need charity." "I'm not offering charity," Della said. I'm a bookbinder with a newly repaired building and no customers. You apparently need a printer since Ruth took the knowledge of it with her when she went south. I have that knowledge too. I don't have a press yet, but I know where to source one second hand, and I know how to run it. Flora was quiet for a long time, in the way of someone whose silence is itself a kind of thinking. Then she said, "Come back in 2 weeks. We'll have decided by then." Della came back in 2 weeks. They had decided. The bindery on Lot 12 has a proper roof now, and a sign above the door that reads simply Rusk & Co., print and binding, though there is no co. It is just Della, and the sign is a small private joke she allows herself. There is a press inside. A small but serviceable Washington hand press she sourced through a retiring printer in Sudbury and paid for with what remained of Ruth Aubon's savings after she had replenished everything she'd drawn from it. The people of Kettlebrook are her customers, and, more than that, her neighbors. Douglas Pratt, the hauler, brings her paper and ink on the first of each month, and he has stopped being surprised by her and started being something closer to quietly proud of her. In the understated way of a person who witnessed the beginning of something and finds it worthwhile to have been present for it. She thinks sometimes of her Uncle Morris Dale, who entered her existence in his ledger as a cost and closed the account when the cost exceeded the benefit. He would not recognize if he drove down the Kettlebrook Mill Road today. If he could even find it, which he couldn't. The person who had walked out of his storeroom with $94 and a canvas tool roll and nothing else. He had looked at a girl and seen a redundant household arrangement. He had not understood that redundant, in a person, is not the same as finished. He had never learned the lesson his own commerce should have taught him, that the value of a thing is almost never obvious from the outside, and the people who write something off the fastest are usually the people who looked the least carefully. On the workbench beside the press, in the early light of a working morning, two things sit in the same low patch of sun that comes through the east window. One is the bone folder, her mother's, worn yellow warm, the edge still true after all these years of use. The other is the brass R, the single typeset character, that Ruth Aubon, bookbinder and printer of Kettlebrook, had left at the bottom of a box beneath a hearthstone at the end of a road everyone else had given up on. Della picks up the folder. She runs her thumb along the smooth curve of it, the way she has done 10,000 times before, the way her mother's thumb wore the surface to exactly that finish over years of work. She thinks of what she was given. The patient skill of her mother's hands, the quiet instruction of an old bookseller who saw her worth when no one else thought to look, and the forward-reaching trust of a woman named Ruth Aubon who hid money beneath a stone and wrote a letter to a stranger and believed, with the practical, unglamorous faith of someone who has set a great deal of type in her time, that the stranger would be worthy of it. None of them had known how things would turn out. All of them had prepared for someone else's future as carefully as if it were their own. The mill road had not led nowhere. It had led here, to this stone-walled room, to this morning light, to the smell of ink and paper that is, she knows now, the truest smell of home she has ever known. We hope this story found you somewhere warm tonight. If it stayed with you, we'd ask you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who is standing at the end of a road that everyone else says leads nowhere. And before we go, we'd like to leave you with this. What's the thing in your own life that everyone called worthless, that turned out to hold everything worth having? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone, and we're grateful you're here with us.